Hi, my name is Victoria Leach, and I did my project on patient outcomes. So, the main problem that I'm looking at is poor patient outcomes resulting from increased nurse-to-patient ratios. I think this project is so important just because it's a problem all over the world. It's one healthcare workers are faced with each and every day that they go to work, and it's a huge safety risk for the patients. So I found a study that was completed in 2018, and Griffiths found that hospital mortality was 4.1%. For every day that a patient experienced increased nurse-to-patient ratios below ward mean, the risk of mortality was increased by 3%. On the other side, every additional hour an RN was available for the patient during the first 5 days of stay showed a 3% decrease in mortality rate, which just goes to show how important it is to have adequate nurse-to-patient ratios. So that brings me to my PICO question. In inpatient hospital units, does adequate nurse-to-patient ratios compared to increased nurse-to-patient ratios decrease the risk for poor patient outcomes? So my P is inpatient hospital units. The I would be adequate nurse-to-patient ratios. The C is increased nurse-to-patient ratios, and O is decreased poor patient outcomes. So when I started my literature search, the first thing I did was go into Google and I just searched increased nurse-to-patient ratios, just to get an idea of how many studies have been completed and what I was going to be working with. So then I went into Open Athens, which then took me to the EBSCOhost website, and I used Medline Complete. So when I first started, I used increased nurse-to-patient ratios, patient outcomes, and nursing. With this, I got like over 500 articles, which was just way too many to look through. So I went back and I made sure I had the settings set to within the past 5 years, that it was peer-reviewed, and I changed the heading to inpatient hospitals. So I just got inpatient hospitals instead of everything. This helped to narrow it down a little bit and get right to the point. So when I was choosing my articles, I made sure that they were within the past 5 years. They were primary articles, they were peer-reviewed. And with mine, I decided to do it on a variety of units. I didn't just choose to pick like all units. I did really like any unit that was inpatient. So finding articles, it can be difficult at times when you're trying to find the right article and trying to make sure that it's primary, but like with adequate time, I was able to do it. Sometimes I had a little bit of time just trying to make sure that it was a primary article, make sure that it was relevant, and that it was going to help my research. But aside from that, I didn't have too difficult of a time. So that brings me to my articles. One of the first articles I looked at was from Griffiths, and this discussed the need for more registered nurses in order to decrease mortality rates. So as I talked about in one of the previous slides, every additional hour an RN was available for the patient during the first 5 days of stay showed a 3% decrease in patient mortality. So this just shows how important it is that we do have adequate nurse-to-patient ratios, and so we can adequately care for our patients. This also looked at nursing assistants, and the use of nursing assistants to replace the shortage of a registered nurse is not acceptable, and it does not help to decrease mortality rates. So we really just need adequate nurse-to-patient ratios. And then the next study I looked at was with Aiken, and that discussed how increasing the nurse-to-patient ratio by just 10% can increase the mortality risk by 11%. This was also done in inpatient, just like Griffiths. And when I compared the two of them, there was also discussion in this one regarding the replacement of nurses with nursing assistants, and that actually showed an increased mortality rate as well. So it's really not appropriate to replace nurses with nursing assistants. They don't have the same qualification or skill that a registered nurse does. And then I went on to Watson, which this study was completed based off of the NICU. And this discussed how having 1-to-1 nurse-to-patient ratio in the NICU showed a decreased mortality rate. The study actually showed that 1-to-1 nursing decreases the monthly infant death to 0.6 per 100 infants from 4.5 per 100 infants. So really having the adequate amount of nurses, especially for these new babies, is really important to decrease mortality risks. Then I went in to look at this study done by He, and this discussed more so, instead of about mortality, just about poor patient outcomes in general, about how patient falls and hospital-acquired pressure ulcer rates are increasing when there's increased nurse-to-patient ratios, because the nurses are not having enough time to be with their patients, reposition them, take them to the bathroom, things like that. So, with that study, that brings me to the next one about Kikas, which he also just discussed how patients in the post-anesthetic care units are experiencing hypoxemia, bradycardia, and arterial hypotension more when there's an increased nurse-to-patient ratio. I just put an example on here about the hypoxemia. It showed that with adequate nurse-to-patient ratios, only 22 patients got this, but with increased nurse-to-patient ratios, 196 patients got it, which is severely a huge difference and really shows that we really do need adequate nurse-to-patient ratios. So with these two studies, they just talk more about poor outcomes instead of patient mortality, because it's not always about patient mortality, but really it can just be about different infections or diseases that the patients acquire from not having adequate nursing care. And then lastly, I threw this study in here because this discussed how increased nurse-to-patient ratios decrease the quality of care, because again, nurses aren't having enough time to spend with their patients. This study, it was a little different from the other ones. It didn't talk about mortality or talk about like poor outcomes, but this one talked about the quality of care, and that's just as important when we're dealing with our patients. And it also just discussed like some of the reasons that why this is happening. So quality of patient care is very important as well, and that is also decreased when we don't have adequate nurse-to-patient ratios. So when I look back at my literature searches, again, they can be difficult, but I found it really important with these to stay organized. I found that I needed to print out all my articles, and then I had to go through the articles like one by one, and I took a highlighter with me, and I just highlighted like the important findings so that when I go back, I can just go to those important parts that I know I wanted to look at. And then it was also important when I was going through to say, like, are these articles appropriate? Are they going to help my literature search? And I actually found 2 of them I had to get rid of. I wasn't able to use them. One wasn't a primary source, and the other one just wasn't appropriate for this project. But the other ones I found were once I critically evaluated them, and then that was when I was able to go in and compare and contrast them and see what the different studies were saying. So some challenges can just be not having enough information in the article itself or not having information needed for the project, and that's when I had to go and get rid of 2 of them. And then the one article I found, the one I just discussed about the quality of patient care, that one necessarily didn't have certain like a study completed about poor patient outcomes or mortality, but it did talk about the quality of care for the patients, which is also really important. So I was able to put that in there as well. So the recommendations that I came up with are arrange inpatient hospital units to have adequate nurse-to-patient ratios at all times to increase quality of patient care, decrease poor outcomes, and mortality rates. Griffiths suggests lowering nurse-to-patient ratios on acute hospital units would benefit patient outcomes. Also, further strategies need to be implemented to improve the supply of RNs. And then, in addition, Atkins also suggested that lowering nurse-to-patient ratios and providing one-to-one care for NICU babies would help to decrease preventable errors along with patient mortality. And they also found that further research is is suggested so they can learn more about preventing other diseases and infections with lower nurse to patient ratios, which is something some of my other articles talked about, whereas this one just talked more about the mortality. The other ones also talked about just poor outcomes like the pressure ulcers and the bradycardia, stuff like that. So implementing this can be difficult, but I find that implementing this issue, we can do that by recruiting more nurses, having job fairs, educational programs about being a nurse, like for high school students, offering bonuses, and scheduling an additional nurse in case of call-offs, which I think is really important because lately on the unit that I've been working on, we've had some call-offs and we've been adequately staffed, and then with the call-offs it makes it really difficult. So I know some issues, it can be costly if like offering bonuses or scheduling that additional nurse, but I think it's really important because we're going to be paying for poor patient outcomes and poor like lawsuits if mortality is occurring. So I think putting an extra nurse there would be really important. Also, becoming a nurse takes time and education. People, so you can't just say, oh, we're going to have these people become nurses. It takes years, so that's also a potential issue. And then people not wanting to run the job fairs or educational programs can be difficult as well. They don't want to work extra overtime or go through that. So it's really important to work together and find the best way that we can implement this. So in conclusion, increased nurse-to-patient ratios result in decreased quality of care, increased poor outcomes, and patient mortality. In order to have this risk reversed, we need to have adequate nurse-to-patient ratios. This is a problem all over the world and one that we're faced with every day, and it is a huge safety risk. So it's so important that we are able to find the adequate amount of nurses to have adequate nurse-to-patient ratios. This can be difficult, but with the help from everyone involved, we can continue to save more lives. So let's do this. And lastly, this is my reference page. And thank you for watching.